All right. All right. All right. So an old car in the woods. All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Very, very happy to have you here with us this morning. My name is John Humphrey. On behalf of the Sunday Forum Committee, I'd like to welcome you to our event this morning. Just in case anybody doesn't know, it looks like people here should know this, but there is a couple restrooms right outside the door here if anybody needs that at any point. I believe you're going to be taking questions at the end. Katie Lynn, who I'll introduce in just a minute, will take questions at the end of her presentation. So please feel free to store them up. Welcome also to any of you who are here with us online, and we will happily take questions from you as well. So please feel free to use the Q&A feature of Zoom and submit questions to us online. There are handouts here in the room, and if anybody didn't get handouts yet, just know that they're there, and there are several different ones there, so you can take advantage of that maybe at the end of the talk. So with that, I'd like to introduce Katie Lynn. Katie Lynn Bunny, our speaker this morning from Monarch Joint Venture. She'll be telling us a little about the history of Monarch Joint Venture, how it became an independent agency, the current situation with monarchs. And anyway, I'll let her get into the details of that. But we're very, very happy to have you with us this morning. Welcome. And at the very end, then I'll let you know what is coming up in future Sunday forums. So with that, thank you.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing? You're alert, you're awake. Wonderful. I'm not quite there yet. Like John said, my name is Katie Lynn Bunny. I'm the education coordinator for the Monarch Joint Venture. We are a national nonprofit based in St. Paul on the other side of the river. And we became a nonprofit about 4 years ago. But before that, we were a University of Minnesota program. So we've been around for about 12 years now, all working towards monarch conservation so that there are monarchs for future generations. So we are 120 partners strong. So I've got some our partner slide here. These are all of our partners. I just updated this morning. So you'll probably recognize several of the logos on that screen. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management. We've got local organizations like Minnesota Native Landscapes and Prairie Restorations, things like that. We've got Minnesota DNR on here, all sorts of things. So our partners range anywhere from federal agencies all the way down to other small nonprofits and volunteer-led organizations. And every single one of these partners is doing something somehow in some capacity for monarch butterflies and other pollinators. But where MJV comes in is directing some of that and connecting some of that. So we have 4 main pillars of our work. We've got habitat, education, partnership, and science. So the bulk of what we do is partnership. We're connecting our partners to the resources they need, connecting people to the resources our partners have. And then we have our 3 other program areas, habitat, education, and science, all working towards the same goal of having monarchs for future generations. My role with MJB is the education coordinator. I get to do events like this. I get to come out and speak to organizations, but I also run teacher professional development workshops in the summer, and I go out to schools as well. So a lot of what I do is very people-facing, people-focused, and many, many hats behind the scenes, as is the nature of nonprofits. So you all are probably familiar with the life cycle of the monarch butterfly: egg, larva, pupa, adult. But it all centers around this one very specific type of plant called milkweed. Milkweed is the monarch's only host plant. Without milkweed, we don't have monarchs. Now, there are about 13 or 14 different species of milkweed native to Minnesota, about 100 native to North America, across the continent. And they can use any one of them as a host plant, and they have been observed doing that. So you can plant any type of milkweed. It doesn't need to be just one, but any type of milkweed can be a host plant for monarch butterflies. When they lay their eggs on the milkweed, it's typically on the underside of the leaves, but not always. Sometimes it's on the top, sometimes it's on the flower, sometimes it's on the seed pod, depending on what time of year it is. But they're very, very small. How many of you have seen a monarch egg before? Could say with confidence that that's what it is. Okay, about half the room. So they're very, very small, about the size of a pinhead. And they're cream colored when they're first laid. And then this picture on the right in the middle is what they look like just before they're about to hatch. They have that sort of blackish tip to them. That's the head of the caterpillar inside. The caterpillar will chew its way out. And then once it's done pulling itself out of its egg, it will turn around and eat the egg casing. That's its first meal, is the egg casing that it hatched from. And then it will start to eat the milkweed. Monarch caterpillars have 5 different stages called instars. The first instar is what hatches out of the egg, and they are extremely small. Most people don't even notice them on the plant. They're typically on the tops of the plants because those have the most tender leaves, but they're about maybe half the length of your pinky fingernail. You're all looking at your fingernails now. So they're about half the length of your pinky fingernail, and they don't have any stripes yet. They don't get those stripes until they start eating milkweed. Every few days, they molt into a different instar. All 5 of the instars are on that large leaf in the center photo there. There is an egg on the top of that, on the top leaf there. There's an egg on that leaf. And this whole process from egg to just before it turns into a chrysalis takes about 2 weeks. So from the time that caterpillar hatches to the time it forms its chrysalis, it's grown in mass 2,000 times its original size. That would be like a human infant growing to the size of an elephant in 2 weeks. Those of you who have children in your lives might know how much food and waste that might produce. So it's kind of an amazing process. But at the end of that 2-week period, they leave the milkweed plant to find a place to form their chrysalis. And they hang in this J shape, which you can see in the photo on the left. They hang in that J shape for maybe half a day. And then they molt one last time into their pupal stage, into their chrysalis. And you can see the chrysalis on the right. These are the only 2 chrysalises I've ever seen. And I'm calling the J a chrysalis because it would have been later that day. These are the only 2 chrysalises I've ever seen in the wild in 10 plus years of being in conservation and natural resources. They're very hard to find, but I know lots of kids who have seen more chrysalises than I have because they're shorter, they see things at a different height. So if you have kids in your life and you're looking for monarch chrysalises, they're the ones to ask. They're really good at finding them. So the chrysalis is a chrysalis for about another 2 weeks. The top series of photos is the first molting into the chrysalis stage. And the bottom series of photos is 2 weeks later, 10 to 14 days on average. So the chrysalis is that beautiful jade green color that we can all recognize as the monarch chrysalis. Just before it's ready to eclose, to come out of its chrysalis, you'll start to see the black and orange of the butterfly coming through in the casing. So a lot of people might say, oh, it's turning clear, it's time for it to come out, but it's not actually turning clear. It's been clear the whole time. It's the organism underneath inside that's changing colors. The pigment is the very last thing to form before they change into their next stage. So from egg to adult, it's about a month, give or take a few days, depending on temperature and resources and things like that. Once that butterfly emerges from its chrysalis, it will hang upside down, like the photo on the bottom right, for about 4 or 5 hours. The first part of that, the first half hour or so, it's the monarch inflating its wings. If you ever get to see a monarch that's newly eclosed, you'll see its abdomen kind of pulse like a heartbeat. It's pushing its hemolymph, its blood essentially, into its wings to fully inflate them. And then they need to dry. So when that butterfly is first out, it's very wet, it's very fragile. It can't really move. I mean, it can move, but it can't fly. It won't be able to fly for another 4 or 5, maybe 6 hours. And even the first 24 hours of it being outside of its chrysalis, it's still pretty fragile until that exoskeleton hardens completely. So this is a very vulnerable stage. Up until they come out of their chrysalis, they're not able to move. They're completely immobile. They're still breathing, living organism inside, but they're very, once something finds them, they can't do anything about it. So their best defense at that point is camouflage. When they eclose, they don't have any defenses except however fast they can walk. They can't get away. And if they fall to the ground or to whatever surface they're above and can't get back up to dry their wings won't dry flat and they won't be able to fly. So the fact that this happens all the time successfully is kind of amazing. And kind of a miraculous feat of nature, right? And then we have the adult stage, which there are 2 different types of monarch adults. The monarchs that we have here in the summertime, here in Minnesota in the summertime, only live for about a month. The monarchs that migrate to Mexico, which I'll talk about in a second here, can live anywhere between 7 to 9 months. Outwardly, they look identical. Inwardly, they are physiologically different. Monarchs that migrate to Mexico are in a state of reproductive diapause, which means they're delaying maturation to prolong their life until conditions are more favorable for mating and laying eggs. So how many of you wish you could leave Minnesota for the winter? Monarchs don't want to stay here either. There's no milkweed, there's no nectar. So their survival strategy is to migrate and then return when the milkweed is up again in the spring. So the monarchs that leave us in August and September outwardly look the same, but their sexual organs are not fully mature yet. They're small, they're very small, very tiny. But you can't tell the difference unless you dissect them. So outwardly they look the same. They spend the winter in Mexico and then come back in the spring. So before we talk about the migration, because that is a complicating factor in what makes monarch conservation so challenging sometimes, I wanted to cover a few different milestones that monarchs have experienced over the last 50 years or so. So in the mid-70s, 1975, Ken Brugger and Catalina Trail discovered the monarchs overwintering in Mexico. And I put that in quotation marks because the people who lived in that part of Mexico knew they were there. They live there. They see them come every year. So of course they knew. But Ken Brugger and Catalina Trail made this discovery for the rest of the world. That's what made the rest of the world aware of where monarchs were going in the winter. And that was all through Fred Urquhart's Insect Migration Association. He was the first one to tag monarch butterflies. And that has a local history here in Minnesota because the monarchs that Fred Urquhart discovered found when he went to the overwintering sites in 1976 were tagged by 2 middle school students here in Minnesota at the Arboretum. So it's a nice little local story. So that was in the mid-70s. Things were just kind of trucking along as usual until the 1990s, when things really started picking up. There were new conservation orders that came through, lots of monarch community science programs that popped up, things like Monarch Watch, which now does the tagging, took over that operation from Fred Urquhart. The Monarch Lab, which doesn't exist anymore, but was at the University of Minnesota. Journey North, which tracks the migration of the monarchs and other organisms. But things really started picking up in the last decade. So the winter of 2012, 2013, and you'll see in a minute why, sparked concern. So in 2014, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was petitioned by concerned scientists and citizens to review the monarch butterfly for the Endangered Species Act to see whether or not they qualified to be listed as an endangered species. That decision came down in December of 2020, and I'll talk more about that specifically. But because of that process, that kickstarted a lot of different scientific research. So within the last 10 years, we've learned a lot more about monarchs that we didn't know before. Things about how many milkweed stems it takes to produce one migratory monarch, how many milkweed stems we might need to increase the population again. All sorts of things came from the impetus of this Endangered Species Act listing. So the monarchs are right now, and I can't remember, I do, okay. So I'll talk about the Federal Endangered Species Act in a second here, but you might have heard the news from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN Red List, listed monarchs as endangered on their list earlier this summer. The IUCN Red List is different from the US Endangered Species Act. They have similar processes for evaluation, but the IUCN Red List doesn't come with any sort of federal protections. It's just the information, essentially. So they are different, but they do have experts on their panel to review all of these. And there's, if you remind me, I can share a resource out later that there was a webinar earlier this year that talked about this process. This right now does not affect how we do monarch conservation. But the Fish and Wildlife Service essentially came to the same conclusion a few years ago when they listed monarchs as warranted for listing, but precluded by other higher priority species. So when that petition came through in 2014, it kicked off this process of a very brief species status review. That status review showed that they needed a more in-depth species status assessment. So that happened from 2015 to 2018. And then it took them a long time to evaluate those data because there were a lot of them. All of the data went into the Monarch Conservation database. And then the decision came down in 2020 that monarchs are warranted but precluded by other higher priority species. So they meet all of the qualifications to be endangered under the Endangered Species Act, but there are other species that are in worse shape than monarchs. So they got put on the list first. Now, it is expected that they will be listed in 2024, the fiscal year 2024. And for those of you who are aware, the federal fiscal year starts in October of 2023. So we could have a decision as early as next fall on whether or not monarchs will officially be listed under the Endangered Species Act. At that point, they will receive federal protections, but there will be laws that have to be written and all that kind of stuff, which may take some time because legislation takes time. So part of why it's so complicated to know what's going on with monarchs and what makes it sometimes very challenging to do what we know monarchs need is because they migrate. So in the fall here, monarchs in Minnesota will migrate to Mexico. They leave sometime middle to end of August, early September, and fly in one leg all the way to central Mexico. They will stop for nectar along the way. But they're not breeding. They're not laying eggs. There might be a few monarchs that stop maybe along the Gulf Coast. But for the most part, it's Mexico or bust. They're going straight there looking for food along the way. And they actually gain weight on that migration. It's like tenths of a gram. But when you weigh the weight of a paper clip, that makes all the difference. So they gain weight on that migration. So it's important during the migration that they have food sources, that they have nectar along the way. Otherwise, they won't gain enough weight to survive the winter. So they spend the winter in Mexico. That overwintering generation, like I said, can live up to 9 months, which is kind of mind-boggling when the rest of the year they only live 2 to 6 weeks at most. But they're not really doing a whole lot in Mexico. They're kind of biding their time waiting for temperatures to be right again. There are also monarchs that overwinter in California. Those monarchs migrate from the western states. The continental divide divides the two populations, the Rocky Mountains. So monarchs do overwinter in coastal California in different types of trees on the coast. But no matter where they are, they're clustered in the thousands. When there are enough of them, they're clustered in the thousands. So they do that to conserve body heat, to trap heat between their bodies to keep them warm. It's the mountains of central Mexico. It's not like they're going to Cancun. It's not warm. It's not warm. It's, 40, 50 degrees tops most days. If it's sunny, it might get to 60, 65 later in the season, but it's still winter. It's It's not a Minnesota winter, but it's still winter. When nectar becomes available, when the sun gets higher in the sky, they'll start to become more active. They'll start seeking out water to drink. There's not a lot of nectar during the winter, if any, but it does start to appear later in the season as spring starts coming through. So they'll find nectar when it starts popping up. That's usually when they're about getting ready to leave the overwintering sites anyway. That usually happens in March, early to mid-March, maybe late February if it's a really warm year. But early to mid-March is when monarchs start to leave. They'll leave central Mexico and coastal California. And monarchs in the eastern flyway will get to the southern part of the United States, Texas, Louisiana, parts of Oklahoma. And they will lay their eggs. They'll lay their eggs. They're mating along the way, and then die. So those monarchs that left us in the fall don't make it back up to their birthplace, but their offspring do. So the offspring that they lay in Texas and Louisiana and Oklahoma and other southern states, when they grow up to adults, they continue the migration northward to the rest of the Midwest area and Northeast. Then we have, 2 to 3 generations of monarchs breeding throughout the summer here. And that final generation is the one that completes the cycle to go back to Mexico. So I've got a fun little animation to go through that one more time, because sometimes it helps to see it all at once. So monarchs leave the north in August, early September. They migrate through the United States through, my animations aren't working. My butterflies aren't moving. So they migrate through the south to go to Mexico in November. They're usually there by the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, which has other cultural significance and things like that in central Mexico. And then in March, they migrate north. I don't know. Sorry, that was less exciting than I thought it was going to be. The butterflies are supposed to move. So then in March and April, they're breeding, laying eggs along the flyway. Those adults that were overwintering then die. And then their offspring move north into the breeding range that we have here in Minnesota. One question we get a lot is if Western monarchs ever overwinter in Mexico. And the short answer is yes. There is some interchange between the two populations. There was a study done by the Southwest Monarch Study that tags monarchs. They tagged monarchs in Arizona. And depending on which day they were tagged, because some weather came through and changed weather patterns, depending on the day they were tagged, some of them were recovered in California and some of them were recovered in Mexico, which is really interesting. So they are genetically similar. Monarchs in the East and the West, they're genetically similar to each other. They're still the same species. They can interbreed and intermingle, things like that. But when we look at things on a global scale, while they are all still the same species, they are genetically distinct, genetically different. So monarchs in North America are that kind of goldenrod, orangish yellow color. The red there on the right are monarchs in the Pacific Island monarchs. The blue on the bottom are Atlantic monarchs. Then we have kind of the purple way on the end, which are Central and South American monarchs. And then that teal color on the top are commercial monarchs, monarchs that have been removed from their population and bred multiple times. And that's the concerning population. We don't know what's going on with that one. So we know that all the other ones may be moved around by people, but essentially are still natural populations. The commercial monarchs are now so far removed from their wild counterparts that they have their own branch on this genetic tree. So something to keep an eye on. It's also why we don't recommend purchasing monarchs to release, because they're usually from a commercial breeder. So how do we estimate this population? I've been talking about monarchs, and I know many of you probably already know that they're in decline, but how do we know that? So monarchs conveniently all go to the same place every year, which makes them easy to count. We can't say that for most other insects. Most other insects are so broadly dispersed that it's really difficult to tell how many there are left. But monarchs all go to central Mexico or coastal California. So this picture up here on the screen, those of us in the north, we might see these trees and think, oh man, it got really cold there. They're frostbit. They're not frostbit. They're covered in monarch butterflies. So they're orange because they're covered in monarch butterflies. This photo was taken by Dr. Lincoln Brower in the 1980s. So it's not quite this spectacular anymore. But what science, and I put this up here because it's really good at explaining or helping me explain how scientists count the population. So what they do is they geotag one corner of this space that monarchs are taking up. And then they go around on foot and measure the area that the trees that are holding monarchs take up. And that's how we estimate the monarch population in Mexico. They're estimated by how much space they take up, not by individual. They're still too numerous, and there aren't good protocols for estimating monarchs by individual when there are that many. So they do this at all the overwintering sites throughout the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, and then add all of those up to give us graphs that look like this. So this is the eastern monarch population for the last 30 or so years, basically since we started counting, we, meaning the scientific community, started keeping track of them like this. So what do you notice about this graph? It tells us a story. There's a story here. It's definitely declining. Even if you take out that year, and I know it's kind of hard to read on the screen for those of us in the room, but that tall year at the beginning is the winter of 1996, 1997. Even if we took out that one and maybe consider that an outlier, there is still a downward trend. So the winter of 2013, 2014, monarchs took up 0.67 hectares in central Mexico. 1 hectare is about 2 football fields. And that was alarming. It really kind of lit a fire under everyone to get going on this monarch conservation thing. In contrast, the Western population, they are estimated by individual, kind of like the jelly bean jar trick. You count a number here and then extrapolate it to the whole cluster. But there are few enough of them in California that they can be estimated by individuals. 2 years ago, the winter of 2020, that year really sucked, but the winter of 2020, there were fewer than 2,000 monarchs in California counted. Now, you'll notice there's a big bump in 2021. There were 250,000 monarchs last year. That's a huge change. We don't know the story of this graph yet. We don't know why monarchs increased so much. We're happy they did, but we don't know what the driver was. It could be that not all the monarchs migrated in 2020 and the 2 years previous. It could be that they just had a really great breeding year. It could be a combination of those factors. But it's based on reports now from this year in the West. It's looking to be maybe not quite so high, but close. Definitely higher than 2,000 because several of the sites have already reported several thousand, which is great. But that doesn't mean our work is done. So we see one bar here back up to 250,000 and we think, oh, that's great. But that doesn't mean that our work is done. That doesn't mean that we can relax and say, okay, monarchs are going to be fine, because they won't be. The problems that have led to this decline are still there. And those problems are complicated. Primarily, they are human driven. So the habitat loss, climate change, pesticide use, these are all the 3 main drivers of monarch decline across the US, across Canada, across Mexico. Climate change is the biggest one. Habitat loss is another one. And then pesticide use is pretty specific to some areas. The Corn Belt region where we are, it is a concern. But it's also a concern in California. California has a huge agricultural industry as well. So these are things that we can do something about. We can mitigate the effects of climate change. We can plant more habitat or reduce the amount of habitat or eliminate the amount of habitat that we're converting into other uses like development and rights of way and roads and things like that. And we can be more responsible in our use of pesticides and use less harmful pesticides. These are things that we can take action with. And I'll talk more about what we can do with some of those also. The things that we don't necessarily need to worry about, but should keep an eye on, are the natural threats. These are things that monarchs have evolved with. These are things that monarchs have, they know how to, they have strategies to combat these things. There are predators. Everything has a predator. We have predators. We're just really smart and most of the time can avoid them. There are parasites that monarchs encounter. There are things like weather, which is different from climate change. Weather does have an effect on monarchs. So all of these are natural causes of death for monarchs. Only about 2 to 5% of the eggs laid by a monarch will make it to adulthood, which is not a lot, but that's very typical of anything that lays a lot of eggs. Any insect that lays a lot of eggs has a very low survival rate. Turtles, octopuses, like fish, things that lay lots of eggs do so because the stakes are so high, because there are so many pressures on their population. So, and I understand the urge, believe me, I do, to want to save every single monarch you see, but we don't have to do that. We can put those efforts in other areas by putting more habitat in the ground, by voting to mitigate the effects of climate change, by talking with our dollars, where we put our dollars, how we use our money, and by being smart with how and where and how often we use pesticides. I'll skip this. It's just one of the diseases monarchs have. So when we talk about quasi-extinction risk, this is the risk at which, or the point at which a monarch population could no longer recover. So there were several analyses done in that period between 2014 and 2018 during the species status assessment. The Simmons et al. Paper that was published in 2016 put the quasi-extinction threshold of Eastern monarchs to 0.01 to 0.25 hectares. The risk of reaching those levels is very high, 3 to 42% by 2025, which is 3 years away, and 48 to 69% by 2075. So it's high, it's possible. The Western extinction risk, the quasi-extinction threshold is 20,000 to 40,000 individuals. The risk is so high, we've seen it 3 years in a row. So the chance of seeing Western monarchs go extinct is 99% within the next 60 years. That doesn't mean it's going to happen though. It means that now's the time to do something about it. There are lots of people doing things. People have already figured out what our target should be. For Western monarchs, our goal is 500,000. For Eastern monarchs, our goal is 6 hectares. Now, when we reach those numbers, that still doesn't mean we're done. We want to be comfortably above those numbers to know that we've done what we need to do. Which these numbers are already comfortably higher than the quasi-extinction levels. So this is kind of depressing. So I always end on a hopeful note. Have hope. Oops. There are lots of people working on this. Over 120 partners for the Monarch joint venture. And that's not even all the Monarch organizations that are doing work. There are smaller community organizations, individuals that are doing things for monarchs all over the country, all over the continent. And it's not just monarchs. We use monarchs as a flagship for conservation because people love them, because they're so commonly recognized. They still have a relatively common host plant. Because people love monarchs, what they do to help monarchs helps other organisms as well. The inverse is true. If people are helping bees or birds or other native organisms, they're also helping monarch butterflies. It's all connected. Nothing exists on its own. And neither do any of these organizations. We all talk to each other. I've talked to somebody at every single one of these organizations. These are organizations in Canada and Mexico that are doing similar work to what MJV and our partners are doing here in the United States. Many of them are federal agencies, but there are also community grassroots organizations in those countries that are doing wonderful work. Someone somewhere is monitoring some part of the monarch life cycle at any given time of the year. People in the north are monitoring eggs and larvae in the summer. People in Mexico and California are monitoring the adults, and there's somebody doing something in between in the shoulder seasons. So what can all of you do, both online, here at your church? You've already started exploring, learning more. Get outside and observe some stuff. Just enjoy time outside. Learn more about monarchs. Our website is a great resource for it. I have some handouts with me. We have probably about 10 more on our website that aren't printed here today. We've got an archive of a conservation webinar series that's free to watch on our website. All sorts of resources out there. The next best thing you can do to help monarchs, and actually probably the best thing you can do to help monarchs, is to plant habitat. That's native plants with a continuous bloom and a diversity of them. You don't want to plant all milkweed. Milkweed only blooms for a few weeks of the year. It's not a great nectar source for the rest of the time. So you want to make sure that something is blooming throughout the entire growing season. Consider host plants for other butterflies, nesting sites for native bees, and nectar sources across the board. Let me just skip that one. I mentioned this already. There are over 100 species of milkweed that are native to North America, so you can look for what's native. There's some resources here. The Xerces Society and Pollinator Partnership both have regional plant guides that are pretty good. My favorite resource is the National Wildlife Federation's Native Plant Finder, which you just type in your zip code and it gives you a prioritized list of things for pollinators that are good to plant based on how many pollinators use them as a host plant and how commercially available they are. It's a really awesome tool. And then MJV and the Xerces Societies both have native plant vendor maps. So you can go to our websites to find native plant vendors. Minneapolis has like 4 of them. They're amazing. Avoid tropical milkweed. It's not native. And it's not really a concern for perpetuating diseases here in Minnesota because it can't survive our winters. It's tropical. But we don't all stay in Minnesota. We have friends that don't stay in Minnesota, and we want to set a good example, right? Tropical milkweed does proliferate in other states, Florida, Gulf Coast, Texas, California, Arizona, anywhere that it's warm and irrigated. It will grow and perpetuate diseases that can harm monarch butterflies. So avoid tropical milkweed, stick with the natives. And avoid pesticides. One of the handouts I have today is one on neonicotinoids. Neonicotinoids are a systemic pesticide that can harm pollinators. So just watch out for it and don't buy the plants that have them, and then maybe tell the nursery why you're not buying those plants. Another way you can contribute to monarch conservation is to collect data for community science programs. Somebody earlier mentioned Journey North. They track the migration. That's an excellent one to get started with. Some other ones include Monarch Watch, which does the tagging, Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, which looks at eggs and larvae during the breeding season, Project Monarch Health, which looks at a protozoan parasite called OE. And then if you have any friends, or if you spend some time in the West, the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper and the Southwest Monarch Study are both active for collecting data on monarchs and milkweed. Contributing data to these organizations, these programs, helps the scientific community at large learn more about them. We would not know what we know about monarchs without the help of volunteers collecting data for these organizations. MLMP alone, the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, has 27 or 28 papers published that have helped us learn more about monarch butterflies, all with data collected by volunteers. So if you've contributed to any of these already, thank you. If you haven't yet, thank you in advance. An extra really impactful thing you can do is to donate to conservation organizations like Monarch Joint Venture. Having donations helps us amplify those dollars where they're needed most. We have a Western Monarch Recovery Fund. We have programs here in the East that we can put those dollars towards to help monarchs where they'll have the greatest impact, through habitat, through education, through science. And the final way is to connect and share. And there are lots of different ways to do this. You're starting in your congregation already, which is wonderful. You can talk to your neighbors, your community in other ways. Best thing you can do, though, is advocate for monarchs at all levels of government, local, state, federal. There are several federal acts out there for pollinators right now for monarchs. And you can find more information on those. They should be on our website, or email me and I'll send you the links to find them. But there are also things like the Farm Bill, which a lot of people don't pay attention to because it's the Farm Bill. And if you're not in agriculture, you feel like you shouldn't. But there are some really important pollinator provisions in the Farm Bill. So keep an eye on that when it comes up again. And Minneapolis is doing great things for monarchs and pollinators. If you get a chance, the Minneapolis Monarch Festival at Nokomis in September is really fun. It's always the first Saturday after Labor Day. So we've got, another 10 months to go, but it's a fun one. Monarchs are the great connector. Everybody loves them. Everybody has a story about them. Every single person that I've talked to already today has told me a story. Every single person I talk to at any other event tells me a story about monarchs, which is really wonderful. Like, it's one of my favorite things about my job is hearing everybody's stories, because it gives me hope that people care. People do care. They're passionate about it. And hearing those stories reminds me of that every day. So with that, a reminder, we can work together to protect monarch butterflies, and we can make a difference for them and other pollinators in the future. So I have time for maybe one question, maybe.
So if you have a question, please use the.
I have a really big voice for the site for native pollinators.
Yeah, what was the site for native pollinator plants? There were a few of them. So the National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finders is one. The Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation has has regional plant guides, and then Pollinator Partnership has eco-regional plant guides. You can type your zip code in there and it'll give you a PDF. Yes.
One comment and question. The Journey North website is perfect for people with grandchildren, neighbors that are small, because you can see the data coming up in the United States, up into Canada. You can see where the monarchs are.
Yeah, I'll just repeat that before you go on to your question so that the people online can hear. So he was saying that the Journey North website have data. They have these maps on their website that show data from all over the country from people's reporting. So if you have children or grandchildren, it's a fun way to watch the monarch migration come up or go down. And they also track milkweed. So you can see, I use it to see when milkweed's going to come up in Minnesota, because I look at when it's coming up in Wisconsin and Iowa, and then I know, oh, spring is coming. What's your question?
The other part is the spiritual connection for believing community. And that is, it is the perfect metaphor for a spiritual life. And if, just use that as curiosity and go forward with that. We were in Mexico at the sanctuaries. I did a 5-year science, National Science Foundation grant with Dr. Oberhauser at the university.
Okay. Were you one of the teachers that went with Karen to Mexico with that?
No, I never went to Mexico with Karen, but
Okay.
I took another group afterwards of 18 people from the cities down, and we saw the sanctuaries in March, the day that they started north.
Yeah.
And we were with Dr. Bill Calvert.
Okay, yep.
Who was, and he called his contacts. He found several of the sanctuaries in Mexico once they established what the altitude and where they needed to be. Anyway, that first day we saw, he figured out that the brunt of the northward migration had traveled 160 kilometers that day on their northward migration. And as we were leaving the sanctuaries, we saw tremendous numbers of monarchs mating on the wing as they're going north. So, and I love the fact that you're paying attention to hope is the most important thing.
We can't do it without hope. Karen Oberhauser says that all the time. I caught that from her. We need hope.
Yeah.
Move forward.
This is the largest. I just know one. I have a friend who collects chrysalis and rears them at home, and he thinks he's doing a good thing. Is he doing a good thing?
Depends. I'll answer this really briefly, and then I know you all have to get to your next service, but So rearing monarchs is a very controversial issue right now for a variety of reasons. There are concerns for diseases and genetics and all that kind of stuff. The summary and what MJB's stance is, and several of our partners, and we have partners that disagree with us on both sides, we have partners that say you shouldn't be raising monarchs at all, and we have partners that say, yeah, it's fine, do whatever you want. We're kind of in the middle. So what we say is that if you're raising monarchs, you should do a few at a time, like maybe 10 a year, and report them to a community science program like the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, Journey North, Journey North, tag them for the migration if it's the right time of year, test them for OE with Project Monarch Health so that it's more than just your household that's learning from that butterfly or those butterflies. You're contributing to a larger data set. And don't purchase your monarchs because that's another concern for a different conversation.
Don't do what?
Purchase them. Yeah, don't buy them from like Amazon or something like that.
So
Thanks, Tom.
can we have a round of applause? Wonderful job. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much. Just really quickly, next Sunday there will not be a Sunday forum, so because of the Thanksgiving weekend, so you get a week off. And then the following Sunday, we have David McNally presenting on love letters from a caregiver. He's specifically talking about dealing with a spouse with Alzheimer's, but caregiving is universal, and so whether it's a family member or a friend or, if you're involved in caregiving, I think you'll find this an excellent presentation. So see you in 2 weeks.